Okay, right. Squeaky chair, randy cat, barking dog, kids on the Easter holidays. What could possibly go wrong? Let's go.
You're listening to Widowed AF with
Rosie Gilmoss.
and Lucinda Boast.
We've invited some members of the world's most exclusive club to bravely share their stories.
Join us for some honest conversations about living a different life, the crushing lows, the surprising highs, and everything in between.
Please note this is a podcast about death. Carefully read the episode descriptions and be kind to yourself.
But for now, welcome to our podcast.
Let's begin.
Hello and welcome back. You've got Rosie here, and joining me today is Jonathan. Hello, John.
Hi again.
So we are going to be talking about Emma Bellamy's episode, which was out on Monday. And the primary reason I've asked John to join me today is because, as many of you will be aware, he had COVID very, very badly back in March 2020. So both of us have had to dig quite deep and go back into a fairly traumatic time. Let's call it what it is. It was really bloody traumatic because nobody knew what was happening. Nobody knew what was going to happen. And for anybody who lost somebody to COVID or watched somebody they love get very poorly with COVID, it was incredibly terrifying. And I also am very aware of people who lost loved ones during COVID to other illnesses or in other circumstances and then had to grieve through COVID. So whilst I'm not diminishing this in any way, we are going to primarily focus on the experiences of people who either lost or experienced very severe COVID in this episode. But I want everybody to know that we haven't forgotten you guys. So yes, Emma, I mean, goodness me, wasn't Jamie young?
Yeah, very young.
So he was in his 30s for anybody that didn't hear. And around a very similar time to you, he was struck with COVID, deteriorated suddenly, went into hospital, fully expecting to come home again, and didn't. And even as I say that, I can feel the hairs going up on my face and the back of my neck, because that mirrors up until the end point what we experienced. You walked into an ambulance. Jamie didn't even walk into an ambulance. And you went off and you were expecting to be intubated and put into a coma for a week, and 5 weeks later you were still in there.
Yeah.
So it must have been very difficult for you listening back to that, John.
Yeah, the editing the episode was really, really difficult. It made me face some memories that I may have pushed to one side, and knowing what I know now, I shouldn't really be pushing memories to the side, should I? But you forget. I'll never forget what happened whilst I was in the hospital. But you forget some of the more finer details, like that was my first time ever in an ambulance.
Goodness me.
And then and I remember getting to the hospital and what an alien place it seemed. It was deserted but busy.
And also, I guess, literally because the medical staff, the PPE they were wearing made them look almost like astronauts, didn't it?
Yeah, you learn to recognise people by their eyes.
Well, and one of the pictures I shared on Instagram the other day, one of the nurses had her name pinned to her visor. And I'm guessing many of them must have done that because it would have been incredibly difficult even for them to recognise each other in the level of PPE they were wearing.
Yeah, and I remember asking you if you could find out who they were, because I do remember Lizzie's name, and I think I said to you, she had her name on a piece of tape over her forehead. Who was that? Although very much more croaky and very much more not really on this planet, but I do remember the faces.
Lizzie was the nurse that held the iPad when you asked me to marry you, because I had to ask her if I'd heard right, because you sort of mouthed it at me rather than asked me, didn't you? I didn't want to take advantage of a vulnerable man.
There wasn't very much vocal cords going at that point. So.
So, I mean, one of the things that Emma talked about in her conversation was the fact that they were trolled. Isn't that awful? Because Jamie was a little overweight, and I've seen photos of Jamie. He looked in good health, and it's not really anybody's business. But when you die of something like COVID, everybody is looking for a reason, aren't they?
Yeah.
Because at the time, particularly, it felt like Russian roulette. Whether you would get it, and then whether it would kill you.
Yeah.
So when it took down a seemingly healthy, youngish and I mean you as well, you were early 40s, weren't you?
Yeah.
And it takes them down, and it takes them down big. Everybody is looking for a why.
Well, the weird thing is, it's a bit like widowhood. There's a set of questions that come when you go down with COVID so hard, which
Hmm.
is, well, you don't have any underlying health conditions, do you? It's like, no, I bloody
Yeah,
didn't. And
yeah.
so I've got a whole new set of questions that people can be inappropriate with.
You're right, actually, because particularly with a cancer death, it is often, how old were they, what type of cancer,
And did
and
you
how
not?
long did it take?
Yeah, and did you not know? Were there no signs? No.
Yeah, because those are and it comes from a place of fear, doesn't it? Because we're all terrified of not knowing that we've got a cancer growing in us. That,
Yeah,
let's be honest, we're all terrified of that.
yeah, and everyone feels the same about COVID because, like you said, it was Russian roulette as to whether you got no taste or came out in a coffin.
Well, us as a couple, so you got taken poorly. We didn't live together at the time. We had put an offer in on the house that we currently live in, and we were in the process of blending the family and the children, and we had this lovely plan. We were going to do it really gradually, and we would stay living in our houses, and and it was going to be. we had so many plans,
We did.
and of course, it didn't work like that because you started to feel quite poorly. You weren't unduly worried at the time. I came and got Holly and said, look, I'll have Holly at my house, let you recuperate. And then as I spoke to you, I could tell that you really weren't getting better, and I started to feel a little bit concerned. And at this point, we were told the children couldn't go to school anyway because we'd been exposed to somebody that may have COVID. So we painted, the metaphorical X on the door, and we up sticks and headed to your house. The dog didn't take the cats. I roped in the neighbour's daughter to feed the cats, and we just relocated. And very quickly, you went from, like a flu type illness to being unable to breathe, and your temperature was through the roof. Your oxygen was very low. You lived near a doctor at the time who put a blood oxygen monitor on the doorstep for me so that I could check it. And then I rang a friend who's a paramedic and told her what I was getting. And she just said to me, Rose, can you do this again for me? Which I did. And then she went, ring 999 immediately. And I will never forget that. I rang 999, they came, and they were, the spacemen came in, didn't they?
Mm-hmm.
Did some tests, and off you went. And at the last minute, I ran upstairs and got a pen and paper and scribbled a note and put it into a bag that I packed for you. And it just said, I love you. And I just, at the time, it just never crossed my mind that I might never see you again.
Well, it didn't me either because once they transferred me from A&E to my own little isolation room, that's when they came and did the COVID test because obviously they weren't testing that early.
Yes, of course.
Um,
of course. You couldn't just go and get tests, could you, back then?
And I remember being sat, I had the oxygen mask on. I think that's where the photo comes from. I've got the oxygen mask on. And one of the PPE nurses, I just saw this little, it looked like a ninja pop up at the window, tapped on the window, gave me a thumbs up, and just mouthed the words, "You've got COVID," which I know why she would send the thumbs up because it was a yes. And then they came in, and I know, and they said, "We're
Well,
we're gonna take you down to ICU. We're gonna incubate you." And then they weren't, and then they were, and then they weren't, and then they were again, and then they came and got me. And I remember saying to the doctor that come, "What if I don't go to ICU?" And he just sort of looked at me and went, "There is no not going." And I went, "How long will I be?" He goes, "Probably about a week." So I was like, "Okay." And they wheeled me off to the room with all the
I've
yellow
got
people. So
all the yellow people. What, because they were wearing yellow
yeah,
PPE?
all the different staff are different colours. So all the obviously these people in the little room where they put me to sleep and incubated me, they were all in yellow, and it was the smallest room with so many people in there. I remember it being so tiny, and there must have been 10 people in that.
See, that in itself is pretty intimidating, isn't it?
Yeah, and then they just like when you go for surgery, like count back from 10, and I'll say it was 5 weeks. 5 weeks have passed, and I opened my eyes again. But I went on my own little journey
And
whilst I was in there.
well, and this is the thing, you see, because while you were in there, the whole world changed. The world came to a standstill like it never has before. We lived through historic times, and it was a 5 weeks like no other, wasn't it? Because during that time, the world stood still. It changed. We lived through a time that nobody has ever lived through before. It was historic and it was terrifying. And during that time, at the risk of making this all about me, I received a phone call from a doctor, and it actually didn't come directly from me. They rang Sarah's sister's husband, so your first wife's sister's husband, Cos, who you were very, very good friends with and almost like brothers,
Yeah.
aren't you? They rang him and they said to him, "We're going to ring Rosie. Can you get to her?" It wasn't allowed, and he had to stand outside the house. This is what the times we were in. He then said to me, "I'm coming over. I won't come in the house, but I've got to come over. They're going to call you." At which point, the ground beneath my feet slipped away, and it's making me cry because I haven't really talked in much detail about this ever. And I knew that they were coming with bad news, because they don't tell somebody to come to you in the time of this if they're going to tell you something positive, right? So I panicked and I rang my friends and I was hysterical. "He's dead, he's dead. Please, they're going to tell me he's dead." At this point, my parents, who are incredibly good human beings and they're rule followers, they got into the car and they drove when you weren't allowed to visit everybody, and they came. So they were on their way. I knew Costas was coming and he was going to be in the garden, and I'm waiting for this bloody phone call and it wouldn't come. And I'm pacing the floor. It reminded Tiger King was all the rage, and I was like one of those tigers. I was pacing, waiting for this phone call. And when it came, "You weren't dead." That was the first thing. That was the first thing. But he told me that you probably were going to die, and that I needed to hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And it was awful. It was bloody awful. And I cried all night and I drank all night and I ranted and I raged and I shouted at the moon, because how the fuck dare the universe do this to me and to you and to Holly? How was I going to look that little girl in the eye, But I can see Jon crying. Sorry, this is horrible.
It's okay. It's okay.
God. And about 4:00 in the morning, I had this flash of inspiration, and I thought, when people are in a coma, their family are told to talk
Yeah.
to them, aren't they? Doesn't matter what, talk to them, play the music, talk to them. We think that they can hear you. And I thought to myself, this guy has been on his own, and he might think that we've forgotten him. We bloody haven't. But the human brain is funny, and I didn't know what you would know. So I woke up and 6:00 in the morning, Mum, I've got an idea. I'm going to go and I'm going to get a dictaphone and I'm going to record messages into it and put some music on it, and I'm going to give it to the hospital to give him. And Mum just said, "Well, they'll never let you do that. You can't go into the hospital." So then I can be quite determined, as you're aware, Jon. So I rang the hospital. I got permission from the hospital. I then went and I stood in the queue that everybody did out at the big Sainsbury's to go into Argos, and this was the first time I'd gone into a shop because people had been dropping food at the house. And even that was scary. And I got the dictaphone and I sat in the car, and people had sent me messages that I'd recorded onto my phone. So I then, again, not a massive tech expert, managed to get them somehow to this dictaphone, and I left you a message, and I had a message from Holly, and I played our song, which is Starlight, and we got it to you. And the next day you turned a corner. And we'll never know whether that made a difference, whether it was just sheer determination and medical expertise, but you came back and you opened your eyes. And gradually, very gradually, it wasn't an instant process. You didn't suddenly get better. It was still a case of some days they'd have good news, some days they'd have neutral news, and some days you'd take a step back. They tried to take the intubation out and they came to put it back in again. But they were bringing you around for longer periods of time, and you started to get agitated and grumpy, and I've never been happier to hear that. And step by step, you got stronger until I appeared at your hospital window one day, where a kind nurse let me go to the window, and we saw each other for
Which
the
was
first
actually
time.
a different hospital, wasn't it?
Oh gosh, yeah, you'd been
moved.
moved. And I know how that made me feel, and I think probably the listeners can understand how that made me feel. But how did it feel for you to see me for the first time?
It was like a moment of clarity, because I'd been away. I mean, I'll be honest, when I first started coming round, and I think during that first call with you, I asked what date it was, because for me, I thought it was Christmas 2020. I thought I'd been away that long. And I was a bit in my own head, like, oh, maybe this COVID thing's over with, and I've just been sat here all this time. But then, I saw you, and all the memories came back. Everything came flooding back in full force, and I just like, I mean, that's why I proposed to you. Because in that thing, I had one moment of clarity, and I had two things I wanted to do. One was to marry you because you're my best friend, and the other one was to, find a step away from work and go and look after my own head, which I should have done after Sarah, if I'm honest. But well, I've done it now. And then
Well, you're so busy firefighting though, but in those days, you're so busy firefighting in that first bit that you can't. Your own mental health does take a bit of a back seat, and horrific though it is that something like this had to happen. It forced both of us, because I had said, during the time we obviously saw some counselling. I saw some counselling for the children, and she one day said to me, "Are you doing anything for yourself?" And I just said to her, "I can't, because if I open Pandora's box, this shit goes down." And I sort of held on to that idea that I couldn't do it until everybody else was safe. And once you were physically safe, we were then able to start sort of unpicking things. And your priority, even after COVID, was your physical fitness. Because tell the listeners a little bit, you were essentially physically completely disabled when you came home, weren't you?
Yeah, much to my own frustration. So when they moved me to the different hospital, Canterbury, I was obviously in the room mentally, because whilst I was in Maidstone Hospital, I didn't know where I was. You remember my delirious chats, when I thought,
Oh, you were taking me out.
I was dying for one of those fruit smoothies from Costa Coffee, and I've got no idea why, but I fantasized about this thing.
Probably you just so dry.
Yeah, when they moved me to the different hospital, because it was just to look after my kidneys, everything else was fine. And I'm sat in this room, and normally they come in about 10 o'clock, and they'd yank me back up the bed because I'd slid down it, and I had no strength to put myself back up again. Turn the room lights off and put my, the lamp at the side of the bed on. And then I'd generally fall asleep, and I could only sleep for about 3 hours for about 4 months after I came out. Anyhow, there's one particular night I woke up, it was midnight, all the lights are still on, so I must have fallen asleep earlier, and they've just let him sleep, leave him alone. So I've slid down the bed, my feet are hanging off the end, well, bunched up at the bottom of the hospital bed. So, and I wanted the lights off and to just be straightened up. So I pressed the buzzer, and no one came. And I'm looking, and the light switch was literally just across the room. Well, I'll go, and I didn't do that. So I sat myself up. Now, when you've been in,
Haven't walked a
well, when
week's
you've been
no
asleep
problem.
for so long, when you sit up, you go from 0 to 50 pints. You are so dizzy. It's like the worst vertigo
Right.
you've ever had. But it settles. So I waited for that to settle. I'm like, right. So all I've got to do is just 2 steps, and I can put the light switch off. Anyhow, I put pressure on one foot and just went down. And by the time nurse
Sucker
came in,
spuds.
I'm laid on the floor at the side of the bed, and she's like, "Where are you, John?" And I couldn't even lift my arms up because they were so weak. So I just sort of like rasped, "Down here." And she told me off.
It's
She's
not
like,
funny.
"What are you doing?" I said, "I just want the light off," and you weren't coming. She's like, "You need to learn some patience." And she was she was right. So then she had to go get someone else. So I ended up being on the floor for probably about 10 minutes. No one's fault but my own. But that's when I understood that, like, this body that I've trusted for so long doesn't work at all. And that was quite a shock.
We were fortunate in that we were able to access physio for you, and this great guy called Charlie, who was the father of a daughter in Holly's class, and also a physio, not just a random dude. He would come around, and basically you were doing, first of all, the aim was to get you off the sofa so you could stand, wasn't it? And he was saying, look, it's going to be quite some time before you can get up the stairs. You've got to be patient. So I made a call and had an outdoor shower put in, because we didn't have a downstairs bathroom, a shower room. And because I needed you to be able to be able to wash, and I didn't know how we'd get you upstairs. Anyway, end of the first session, what have you bloody done? Walked up the stairs. So you are very stubborn, and you are very determined, and I believe that so much of that is what brought you back to life. And I don't mean literally alive, I mean back to life, because when you came home, you were an invalid, and it was horrible to see you like that. I don't feel that's inappropriate to say. It was horrible to see the person that you love reduced from this big, strong, powerful man to somebody that couldn't hold a cup of tea. But you are incredible, Jon. It's nice to be able to publicly say it. You are incredible. The determination that you showed to bring yourself back for me and for Holly and for my children and for yourself, because during that time, we saw you fight so hard. We saw you, it was painful for you physically, mentally, emotionally. When you came home, your own daughter didn't trust that it was you. We later found this out in counselling, because she just wouldn't, she was very unsure and sort of acted out the behaviourally. And it came out in counselling that she didn't quite trust that you were her dad, because you looked so different and you smelt different and you'd been away. And you have to remember that the last time somebody Holly loved went into hospital, they didn't come home. So for her, we've had to, invest so much, lots of time and love and care into building her trust in the medical profession back. And, that if either of us is sick, that we're going to, that we will be okay afterwards. And this is the chain reaction of a big trauma like this on everybody in the house. I think it's fair to say that you and I suffer with health anxiety to a certain degree. We're not completely neurotic, but we are very aware, and we keep checks on things. And it's got better as time goes on. But in the early days, you were checking your blood pressure all the time, where you were really scared that something
the
else
reason
was
wear
going
an
to
Apple
happen.
Watch. I monitor everything. Like, the focus has changed now to measure. I move my body enough when I'm exercising, but back then it was like, how much sleep am I getting? Blood pressure, heart rate. What's my blood oxygen was quite a big one.
Well, because that's one of the big signs of COVID, isn't it?
In the back of my mind was, if this comes back for a round 2, I don't think I can take it on twice.
I can remember the day you got your COVID vaccine, actually. And I'm not getting into a vaccine debate here. I'm staying neutral on this one. But at the time, we felt like this was the end was in sight. And because we'd been so frightened of you getting COVID again, I just burst into tears when I saw you after you'd had it, because A, I didn't know whether the vaccine would be damaging to you, and B, I didn't, the relief, really, I guess, because it felt to me that you were safe then. And you have had COVID since, haven't you? In Mexico. So guess who had to travel home with 4 children? No, you didn't get a single symptom, did you? Nothing. And he did fly home a few days later when he tested negative. I just like to remind regularly about the flight on my own from Mexico with 4 children. Just keeping that one in the bag.
I've had COVID
use.
twice, and both times I've ended up on my own.
No!
Sorry.
Oh, that was
Cut
low.
that
Little insight into our marriage there. So, I mean, it's the long-term implication of COVID, not only on the people like us who, were exposed to a very close call, the people like Emma who, who lost people they loved to it, and their lives were devastated. But even to the mental health of our children and of people around us after living through that pandemic, I don't think there is anybody that can say they came out of it completely unscathed. I think we were all forced to take quite a close look at ourselves as we sort of emerged, blinking into the daylight. And I know that, like us, many people are starting to want to take control of their own health and their own sort of longevity, because the awareness that something like that can happen, it can take down people that are fit and well and healthy. It just, I don't know, once again, it makes me want to grab life and squeeze all the joy out of it. And despite the trauma and the unsettling time that it was, I genuinely think that for us as a family, we have come through it incredibly close and incredibly strong, because if you can survive that together and come out, still able to laugh, still able to joke, still, able to actually spend any time in a room together, then I think you're probably pretty set for life, aren't you? And if you could just not contract any life-threatening illnesses in the near to medium future, that would be helpful. Well, I'm just going to read, if I may, a message that I had today. I asked a friend of mine who is also a consultant anaesthetist and was very, very kind and helpful to me during this time, because I'm not a doctor. I don't have any medical training. I didn't understand at least 2/3 of the words they said, and they were saying it to me down a phone in full PPE. So what I did is I would make copious notes. My handwriting is abysmal, but I can just about decipher it. And then my friend, who has asked to remain anonymous, would contact me, and I would blurt it all out to her, or I'd take a picture of it and send it to her ahead of time, and she would translate it for me, and it was invaluable. So I've once again asked her just to give me a little more of her time and to tell me what it was like for her working through the pandemic. So I'm going to read it because, as I said, she wishes to remain anonymous, which we do respect for everybody. So I'm just going to read this now. As an anaesthetist, I've been trained to look after really sick patients, and I'm usually able to deal with the emotional toll that comes with that. Often, we are the last doctor that a patient will see, and I'm always extra mindful of that. I'm kind to them. I ask them to visualise their family or try and talk about them when they go to sleep. The worst bit about the pandemic was that the patient's family weren't with them, and the hospital team was their only human contact. That made it really difficult for me as a doctor, but also as a mother and a wife. The pandemic was quite a shock to my system, as patients were able to vocalise how they felt, and I witnessed how afraid and equally how tired they were before they went to sleep. They were as sick as the patients I was used to anaesthetising, but they were more alert, and so it was easier to make an emotional connection with them. That possibly made it harder. They looked me in the eye and said, "I don't want to die," before I put them to sleep. The sheer number of these types of patients we had to treat in such a small amount of time was pretty overwhelming. Knowing that most wouldn't get through it has also made me feel pretty helpless. I felt pretty deflated and emotionally exhausted, but naturally, as doctors, our instinct was to give it our best and have hope. The PPE was hot, sweaty, and suffocating. You couldn't drink once you had it on, and my scrubs were soaked through with sweat when I finished my shift. I used to go home feeling pretty knackered, and it was hard to switch off as everyone was asking about it, talking about it. It was all over the media. As time went on, it became part of our normal working routines, and I learned to adopt it into my daily working life. There are times when I remember certain patients and feel really sad and emotional about it, but I know that there is nothing more I could have done to help them. You usually get to know families really well in critical care, and we didn't get the opportunity during the pandemic, as most of our discussions with families were online or on the phone. Talking to my colleagues, we all have patients we remember clearly, and it is still very raw when we think about those that didn't make it. There is one big silver lining in all of this, which is that it showed me how, as a team of doctors and nurses, we could really rise to a challenge together. It really made me proud to be part of my profession. That was powerful. That's the first time I read that. I wanted to read it out live, as it were. So thank you to my anonymous friend who wrote that, because that is powerful. And I want to take an opportunity to thank everybody who worked so hard to save people. And I want to say I'm so sorry to anybody whose person didn't make it.
I've never really had the opportunity on a public platform, especially like the one we've created here, to thank everybody that looked after me whilst I was asleep, to thank you, Rosie, for looking after my little girl, to thank Charlie for rebuilding me from not being able to walk to doing sprints around the back garden, to my counsellor that took me through PTSD training the following year once my physical was sorted, and everybody that sent me a message on that dictaphone. You know, when I listened to them when I was awake, some of them made me laugh, some of them were absolutely on point, but most of the time it reminded me just how much you guys do apparently love me. So thank you. Thank you, everybody.
I think I'm going to end it there, actually, because I feel quite emotional. But if you have been affected by this episode, if you would like to talk to us about anything, you know where we are. It can be private, or it can be something that you would like us to air, but you know where we are. And thank you to everybody for listening today.
Thank you for listening today. We'll be back with you soon for more from the front line of loss.
But for now, as you were,